His name was Datis. He was not a villain. He was not a fool. He was the most decorated field commander in the most powerful military force on earth. A man who had spent his career turning the king's orders into accomplished facts. He had sacked cities, deported populations, crossed seas, and he had never lost. On the morning of September 12th, 490 BC, Datis stood on a beach in Greece and watched 10,000 men in bronze armor start running toward him. He had one thought: this is a mistake. He was right. It was a mistake. It was their mistake. And by the time he understood why, by the time anyone in the Persian high command understood why, the world had already changed in ways that none of them would live to fully trace. This is not the story of Marathon. You know that story. This is the story of what Marathon looked like from the other side. The Empire, September 490 BC. A Persian war council somewhere on the Greek coast. Oil lamps, salt air, the sound of 25,000 men sleeping on the beach. Datis looked at the hills above Marathon and saw exactly what he expected to see: a smaller army, a disorganized city-state, a problem that would be solved by noon. He was wrong. But here's what no history class ever tells you. Datis didn't lose because the Greeks were better soldiers. He lost because the Persian strategic model, the one that had crushed Egypt, swallowed Babylon, and broken the Scythians, simply had no protocol for what happened next. The Persians had never seen a full-speed infantry charge across open ground, not once in 30 years of conquest. That tactical blind spot still shapes the world today. The border between modern Greece and Turkey, one of NATO's most sensitive fault lines, runs almost exactly where the Persian Empire's westward advance stopped, at Marathon. To understand what Datis saw that morning, you first have to understand what the Persian Empire actually was in 490 BC. Not what the movies made it, what it actually was. The Achaemenid Empire controlled roughly 5.5 million square kilometers, the largest empire the world had ever produced. From the Indus River in modern Pakistan to the shores of Libya, from the Black Sea to the Persian Gulf, it contained somewhere between 35 and 50 million people, which historians estimate was between 40 and 50% of the entire human population of the planet at that moment. Let that land for a second. One government, half the people on Earth. And Darius I, the man who sent Datis and Artaphernes to Greece, had built most of that in 20 years. He inherited a crisis. In 522 BC, when Darius seized the throne, the empire was mid-collapse. Multiple pretenders, regional revolts from Egypt to Babylon. The whole structure that Cyrus and Cambyses had assembled was fracturing at the edges. Darius suppressed 19 rebellions in a single year. He documented every one of them himself, carved in 3 languages into a cliff face at Behistun in modern Iran, an inscription that still exists today and that became one of the keys to deciphering cuneiform script in the 19th century. By 490 BC, Darius had turned that chaos into a machine. The Persian military system wasn't just large, it was sophisticated in ways that Greeks wouldn't develop for another century. A professional logistics corps that could move supplies across 3,000 kilometers of road. A relay postal system, the Angarium, that transmitted royal messages from Susa to Sardis, roughly 2,700 kilometers, in under a week. a multi-ethnic army that integrated cavalry, archers, engineers, and infantry from 20 different nations under a single command structure. Against this, Athens in 490 BC had a citizen militia, no professional army, no cavalry worth mentioning.
A total fighting force at Marathon of approximately 10,000 hoplites, plus 1,000 Plataeans who arrived as allies. That was it. Datis had sailed from Samos with a force that ancient sources put at between 20,000 and 100,000 men. Modern historians, working from logistics and fleet capacity, settle closer to 25,000 soldiers and 600 ships. Still, at minimum, a 2-to-1 numerical advantage, possibly much more. Datis was not a fool. He was not arrogant in the way the Greeks later portrayed him. He was a professional soldier who had already taken the island of Naxos, sacked Eretria, and deported its entire population to Persia, exactly as Darius had ordered. His track record on this expedition, before Marathon, was perfect. He chose the plain of Marathon deliberately. It was the best cavalry terrain on the Attic coast, wide, flat, an open kill zone for mounted archers. The same topographical logic that Persian commanders had used to dominate battlefields from Anatolia to Central Asia. On the evening before the battle, according to later Greek sources, Datis walked the perimeter of his camp with a junior officer. The officer asked how long it would take. Datis looked at the plain, at the Greek camp in the hills, at the flat ground between them. "1 morning," Datis said. 2 at most. He went to sleep. There was only one variable Datis hadn't accounted for. The Greeks weren't going to wait. Most accounts of Marathon focus on the Greeks, their courage, their discipline. Miltiades and his tactical genius, the thin red line that held. I think that framing misses the more important story entirely, because the real question at Marathon isn't why the Greeks won. It's why the Persians, in the middle of a battle they were winning by every rational metric, suddenly found themselves losing a foot race to a wall of bronze. Here's what actually happened on the morning of September 12, 490 BC. The Athenian generals had been deadlocked for days. 10 strategoi, 1 vote each, split 5 to 5 on whether to attack or wait behind the city walls. The tiebreaker was the polemarch, the war archon, a man named Callimachus. Miltiades made his case in the war council the night before the battle. We don't have a transcript, but the argument he made, reconstructed from Herodotus and later Athenian sources, went something like this. If we do not fight now, I promise you a great disturbance of minds which will shake the resolution of Athens. But if we fight before any unsoundness appears among our citizens, we can win this battle, the gods being impartial, on fair terms. Callimachus voted yes. That single vote is the pivot point of Western history. But here's the detail that gets buried. Miltiades didn't just propose attacking. He proposed attacking at a run. The Greek line advanced across roughly 1,500 meters of open ground at a sprint, in full bronze armor, carrying 8-foot spears and heavy shields. Each man was carrying somewhere between 50 and 70 pounds of equipment. The Persian archers, who were the backbone of Darius's military system, needed a stationary or slow-moving target to be effective. At distance, volleys of arrows against a walking formation would have been devastating. Against men sprinting at full speed across 1,500 meters, the window of effective fire collapsed to seconds. Datis had never seen this. No Persian commander had. Picture what it looked like from the Persian side of the plain. Dawn. The Greek camp is quiet. Then, movement. The entire Greek line steps forward. And then, instead of the slow advance that every army in the known world used to close distance and preserve formation, they accelerate. They are running, full speed, across a mile of open ground, in armor. A Persian archer in the front line would have had time to lose perhaps 2 or 3 volleys before the bronze wall was on top of him. His training told him to hold. His training had never prepared him for this. In every prior engagement, against Lydians, Egyptians, Babylonians, Scythians, the enemy either stood their ground and absorbed the arrow storm, or broke and ran before contact. The concept of a disciplined infantry charge directly into the teeth of an archer line was outside the Persian tactical vocabulary entirely. It wasn't cowardice that made Datis unprepared. It was experience. 30 years of conquest had taught Persian commanders exactly what worked. Marathon was the first battlefield where that knowledge became a liability. The Persian center held initially. In fact, it pushed the Greek center back. For a few minutes, the battle looked exactly like Datis expected it to look. Then the Greek wings, intentionally reinforced and thinned at the center, collapsed inward on both Persian flanks simultaneously. A double envelopment. The Persians in the center, already pushing forward, suddenly had Greeks behind them. 6,400 Persians died on that beach. The Athenians lost 192 men. Those 192 were buried in a mound that still stands at Marathon today. You can visit it. Tourists do, every week. Most of them have no idea that the geopolitical consequence of what happened on that ground, the decision that the Greek world was worth defending, is still being argued over in Brussels and Ankara right now. But Datis survived. He re-embarked his army. He still had his fleet. And somewhere on the water between Greece and Persia, he had to compose in his mind the message he would deliver to the most powerful man in the world. The report. Datis came back to Darius's court at Susa with something no Persian general had carried home in 30 years. A loss. Not a catastrophe, not an annihilation. The fleet was intact. Most of the army had re-embarked in good order. Eretria had been destroyed and its population was already en route to resettlement in Persia. That part of the mission was complete. By Persian imperial accounting, the expedition had achieved roughly 2/3 of its objectives. But Athens still stood. And 6,400 men were in the ground at Marathon. We don't have a Persian account of what Datis reported. That's not an accident of history. It's a feature of how the Achaemenid Empire managed information. Persian royal records were not written to document failure. The Behistun inscription that Darius carved into the cliff face lists 19 victories. It does not mention Marathon. Not once. In the official memory of the empire, the battle was either a minor setback in an otherwise successful campaign, or it simply didn't happen. The throne room at Susa, carved reliefs of subjugated peoples on every wall, 40 nations, all facing the king. The courtiers don't move. They've been trained never to react before the king reacts. Darius looks at his nephew. He looks at Datis. The silence is the kind that has a shape. And then the king speaks. Not about Marathon. Not about the 6,400 dead on the beach. The mission to Eretria, he says, was completed. That's all. Artaphernes,
The emperor's own nephew, co-commander at Marathon, stands there and says nothing. He came home without the city his uncle had personally ordered destroyed. He will be reassigned to the satrapy of Lydia within the year. No trial, no disgrace on paper, just reassignment. A man moved sideways until he is out of sight. Athens would be handled, later, by someone else, with a larger army. This is one of the most revealing things about how great powers process defeat. The Athenians built a treasury at Delphi to commemorate Marathon. They commissioned paintings. They told the story for generations. For the Persians, the administrative response was silence, a tactical reclassification. Darius began planning the return to Greece almost immediately. He died before he could launch it. In 486 BC, revolts in Egypt consumed the empire's military attention. Darius died in 485 BC, still planning. His son Xerxes would eventually execute that plan. With 300,000 men, a bridge of boats across the Hellespont, and a decade of preparation. The Greeks would call it the Second Persian Invasion. The Persians, internally, almost certainly called it the completion of unfinished business. What none of this explains, and what Datis almost certainly never resolved in his own mind, is the deeper strategic question his defeat raised. Not why the Greeks won, but what it meant that they could. What does it tell an empire when the system that conquered half the world simply stops working? The answer was sitting in plain sight, in the one thing the Persian model had never needed to develop, because until Marathon, it had never needed to. 159 years later, in 331 BC, Alexander the Great walked into Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the empire Datis had served, and burned it to the ground. A Greek soldier picked up a clay tablet from the rubble. He couldn't read it. It was an administrative record, a chalk, perhaps, a written payment order, something ordinary, something the empire had produced by the millions to move wealth across 3 continents without carrying gold on the road. He threw it into the fire. He had no idea what he was holding. He had no idea that the concept encoded in that tablet, the idea of a written financial instrument transferable across distance, would survive the fire, travel through Arab merchants to medieval Italy, and arrive in the English language as the word check, as in checks and balances, as in the foundational mechanism of the constitution his civilization would eventually write. The empire was ash. The idea was already gone, west, carried by the people who had just destroyed it. That is the thing about what Marathon started. The Greeks didn't just stop the Persians. They absorbed them, and then forgot they had. The legacy. The thing the Persian military model never developed was a reason to. For 30 years, the empire had expanded by absorbing opponents who either surrendered or broke. The Lydians surrendered, the Babylonians surrendered, the Egyptians surrendered, then revolted, then surrendered again. The Persian system was optimized for an enemy who recognized that resistance was irrational. The Greeks at Marathon did something the system had no category for. They looked at the most powerful military force on Earth and decided that dying on their own ground was preferable to living under someone else's administration. That decision, not the tactics, not Miltiades, not the sprint, is the thing that echoes forward. Marathon did 3 things that permanently altered the shape of the world you live in today. First, it preserved the conditions under which Athenian democracy continued to develop. The reforms of Cleisthenes in 508 BC had created the basic architecture of democratic governance: equal votes, civic participation, accountability of leaders to citizens. Had Athens fallen in 490 BC, that experiment ends. There is no philosophical golden age, no Socrates, no Plato, no Aristotle. The intellectual infrastructure of Western civilization has a different origin story, or no origin story at all. Second, it created the myth of Greek military invincibility that would sustain resistance through Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea over the following decade. The psychological residue of Marathon, the knowledge that it had been done once, is what kept the Greek alliance from dissolving in 480 BC, when Xerxes arrived with an army that made Datis's force look like a reconnaissance patrol. Third, and least discussed, it established the eastern boundary of Europe. The Persian Empire never crossed the Aegean in force again after Xerxes' failed invasion of 480 to 479 BC. The line between Persian-controlled Anatolia and Greek-controlled Europe hardened into a permanent geopolitical frontier. That frontier, between what is now Turkey and what is now Greece, has been contested, redrawn, and fought over for 2,500 years. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 formalized the modern border between Greece and Turkey after the Greco-Turkish War. It involved the largest forced population exchange in history up to that point: 1.5 million Greek Orthodox Christians expelled from Anatolia, 500,000 Muslims expelled from Greece. Families that had lived on both sides of that line for generations were uprooted in months. That border follows, with remarkable fidelity, the approximate line where Persian westward expansion stopped. The refugee crisis that Europe debated through the 2010 seconds. Syrian and Afghan migrants crossing the Aegean from Turkish to Greek shores crossed that same water. The same narrow channel, the same geopolitical seam between what was once Persian imperial territory and what was once the edge of the Greek world. Marathon didn't cause the Syrian civil war, but the world in which that border exists, in which that seam is where it is a world shaped by what Datis failed to do on a beach in 490 BC. There is one more layer, one that connects the Persian defeat not just to Europe's borders, but to the reason Iran and the West have been in slow-motion confrontation for the better part of a century. The wound that didn't close. Here is the version of this story that almost never gets told in the West. For the Persians, Marathon was not the beginning of a decline. The Achaemenid Empire continued for another 150 years after Marathon, absorbing Egypt again, expanding into Central Asia, administering 50 million people across 3 continents. By any objective measure, one lost battle on a Greek beach was a footnote in the history of an empire that remained the dominant power in the known world until Alexander arrived in 334 BC. But Marathon became something else entirely in the cultural memory of the civilization that descended from Persia. Most Western historians treat the Persian Wars as a Greek story. The Persians are the antagonists, the invaders, the empire that tried to extinguish the flame of freedom and failed. That framing has been so dominant for so long that it has shaped how the modern West understands the civilization that became Iran. I think that framing is not just incomplete. I think it has done genuine geopolitical damage. Here's why. The civilization that produced Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who freed the Jews from Babylonian captivity, whom the Hebrew Bible calls the Lord's Anointed, was one of the most administratively sophisticated, religiously tolerant,
and legally advanced civilizations of the ancient world. The Cyrus cylinder, dated to 539 BC and housed today in the British Museum, is the oldest known declaration of religious freedom in human history. Cyrus explicitly permitted conquered peoples to maintain their religions, return to their homelands, and govern their own local affairs. That is the civilization Marathon belongs to, not the cartoon empire of 300. There is a moment from 479 BC, the year after Xerxes' invasion failed at Salamis and Plataea, that captures this with unusual precision. A Persian nobleman named Mardonius, commanding the last Persian land army in Greece, sent a message to the Athenians before the Battle of Plataea. We have the text, preserved by Herodotus. Mardonius offered them terms: full autonomy, their temples rebuilt at Persian expense, and an alliance with the empire. The Athenian response, delivered to the Spartan envoys who were present: so long as the sun holds his present course, we will never make terms with Xerxes. Two civilizations, two completely incompatible frameworks for understanding what had just happened between them. The Persians heard a refusal of a generous offer. The Greeks heard an existential threat to everything they were. That gap between Persian administrative pragmatism and Greek civilizational absolutism is the gap that still exists today between Tehran and Washington. The Persians offered a deal. The Greeks rejected the premise entirely. Neither side understood why the other couldn't simply be reasonable. Modern Iran carries the Achaemenid inheritance with an intensity that Western policymakers have consistently underestimated. The Islamic Republic's confrontational posture toward the West is not simply theological. It is civilizational. It is the posture of a culture that remembers, correctly, that it was once the center of the world, that it was reduced to a colonial object by European powers in the 19th and 20th centuries, and that the Western narrative of history has cast it as the eternal villain in a story where the West is always the hero. The nuclear negotiations, the sanctions, the proxy conflicts across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, none of these make complete sense without understanding that the country on the other side of the table believes, at some level, that it is the heir to the civilization that once administered half the world. Datis lost at Marathon, but the civilization he served never entirely accepted the Western interpretation of what that loss meant. What Persia gave the West without knowing it. There is one final piece of this that almost no one discusses. What the Persian Empire actually transmitted to the West, not through conquest, but through defeat. What the Greeks absorbed from the enemy they stopped at Marathon runs so deep in Western culture that most people have no idea where it came from. The Persian Wars lasted roughly 50 years, from the Ionian Revolt in 499 BC to the Peace of Callias in 449 BC. During that half-century, the Greek world was in continuous military, diplomatic, and commercial contact with the most administratively sophisticated empire on earth. And Greeks, being Greeks, watched, analyzed, borrowed, and occasionally stole everything that worked. The Persian system of provincial governance, satrapies with appointed regional administrators accountable to a central authority, became the direct template for Macedonian imperial administration under Alexander, and from there for the Hellenistic kingdoms, and from there for Rome. The Roman province is a Persian invention transmitted through Greek hands. Consider what that means in practice. When a Roman governor arrived in Britain in 75 AD, a man who had never been to Persia, who would have been offended to be compared to a Persian official,
He was administering a province using a bureaucratic architecture that Persian engineers had designed 6 centuries earlier. He didn't know that. Nobody told him. The Persian Royal Road Network, 2,700 kilometers of maintained road from Sardis to Susa, with way stations every 25 kilometers, was the most advanced infrastructure system in the world in 490 BC. Greek merchants used it. Alexander used it. The Roman road system, which became the circulatory system of Western civilization, was built on principles that Persian engineers had established 2 centuries earlier.
The Persian concept of a universal king, a ruler whose authority derived not from a single city or tribe, but from a divine mandate to govern all peoples, filtered through Alexander's self-presentation as heir to Achaemenid legitimacy, into the Roman imperial ideology of a universal emperor, into the Christian concept of a universal church with temporal authority, into the political theology of medieval European kingship. The West built itself, in part, from Persian blueprints, and then forgot where the blueprints came from. There's a specific word in the English language that comes directly from the Persian administrative system, a word most Americans use without any awareness of its origin. The word check, as in a bank check, as in checks and balances. The Persian chak was a written order for payment used by merchants and administrators across the empire to transfer value across vast distances without carrying physical currency. It entered Arabic as sak, entered medieval Italian banking as scacco, and arrived in English as check. Every time an American invokes the constitutional principle of checks and balances, they are using a word whose conceptual and linguistic DNA runs back to the empire Datis commanded on the beach at Marathon. The civilization the West defeated is embedded in the language the West uses to govern itself. That's the thing about empires. They don't disappear when they fall. They dissolve into the things that replace them. Their roads become other roads. Their words become other words. Their administrative logic becomes the invisible architecture of systems that no longer remember where the architecture came from. Datis lost Marathon. The Persian Empire ended at Gaugamela in 331 BC, when Alexander finally broke it. But what the empire had built didn't end. It just changed its name. And the simplest proof of that, the one detail that ties everything in this story together, is something most people encounter every single week without once thinking about where it came from. The detail nobody sees. The thing most people walk past every day without seeing is a calendar. Not a Persian calendar, ours. The 7-day week. The structure that organizes every American work schedule, every school term, every religious observance in the Western world, was not a Greek invention. It was not Roman. It was transmitted to the Mediterranean world through Babylonian astronomy, preserved and systematized inside the Persian Empire's administrative and religious infrastructure, and carried westward through the exact commercial and diplomatic channels that the Persian Wars opened between East and West. Saturday, named for Saturn. Sunday, named for the sun. The 7 celestial bodies that Babylonian astronomers tracked, that Persian Zoroastrian cosmology incorporated, that Greek philosophers adopted from Persian sources, that Rome encoded into civil time. The week you live inside was built, in part, inside the empire Datis commanded. That is what Datis couldn't have known on the morning of September 12, 490 BC, when he watched 10,000 Athenians come sprinting across the plain toward his archers. He was trying to solve a tactical problem. He was trying to understand why men in bronze armor were running toward death instead of waiting for it. He never solved it. He sailed back to Susa, filed his report, or didn't. His co-commander, Artaphernes, disappeared into administrative reassignment. Darius died planning the return campaign. Xerxes came and failed at Salamis. Alexander came and burned Persepolis. The empire that had administered half the world was gone in a generation. But the weak survived.
The civilization that Datis served, the one that had built the roads and the postal system and the concept of religious tolerance and the written payment order that became the modern check, that civilization didn't vanish into silence. It dissolved into everything that came after it, into the Silk Road, into Rome's administrative architecture, into the English language, into the structure of time itself, into the week you are living through right now. The border where Datis stopped is still a border today. The civilizational tension between what was once Persia and what was once Greece is still a tension today, visible in every NATO discussion about Turkey, in every negotiation over Iranian nuclear capacity, in every refugee crossing the Aegean in a small boat from a Turkish shore to a Greek island. Marathon didn't stock that tension, but it fixed the line. It said, "Here and not further." And that line has held, in one form or another, for 2,500 years. Most histories of Marathon end with the Athenian messenger running 26 miles to announce the victory, dying on arrival, the original Marathon. But the Persian messenger, the one who carried the news back to Darius, ran further, across the Aegean, across Anatolia, up the royal road to Susa, into a court where failure had no official language. We don't know his name. We don't know what he said. We know that Darius listened and started planning. That's what empires do. They don't accept the verdict. They file it, reclassify it, and wait. Some of them are still waiting. If this story changed how you see the world, share it with someone who thinks they already know how Marathon ended. Every person who watches history from the losing side understands something the winners never had to learn. If you want to be here for the next one, subscribe. We're not done with the ancient world. The next empire we're examining built something the Persians never could, and lost it for exactly the same reason the Persians lost at Marathon. A system so good at winning that it had no idea how to survive peace. That one's coming soon.